Hello, and welcome back to the Tangles and Toons channel, where today we're going to be working on part 3 of the Zentangle OCEAN Project. So let's jump right in. The first tangle that we're going to look at is created by Tomas Padros, and it is called Zenemone. And the details, of course, will be in the description box. But this one, we start by drawing little lazy C shapes, I call it, or I'm not sure what Tomas would have called it, but they're just little curved lines, like a C shape. And we lay those out, and these are going to represent the top of our shape. So we start with the lowest, or the front ones are the lowest ones. Let me just put it that way. And then we layer the taller ones behind it and create our little pattern, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be this specific pattern, but I use this as a simple or basic example. And then the actual shape calls for us to just create the body, or to draw that body of the little sea anemone shapes, right like this, following outside the little C shapes that we created and kind of going straight down. Now I know that Tomas's name for this tangle implies that he thought it looked like sea anemones, which it certainly does, but obviously there are a wide variety of sea anemones, and so they don't all look exactly like this, and that's not what we're trying to say. But this is the perfect tangle to fit in with our ocean project. Now, doing it that way yields some really neat results. We can also add a little variety by creating the same C shapes to begin with, but then adding a little bulb on the top and making our stem or body of the little creature narrower. And this is just a way that we can add some variety. If we're doing a large batch of these little guys, we may want to alter them a little bit just for that visual interest's sake. And so that is an example of how we could do that. Now I want to show you one other thing before we look at the shading. So taking the same pattern can be drawn a little more free form, and we'll start in this case with the body of our tangle, and this will allow us to more freely layer these into interesting patterns that might more mimic the real-life creature of the sea anemone. And that's just an interesting side note for you, is that a lot of folks think that sea anemones are plants. They are not. They are invertebrate creatures, much in the same class as jellyfish, or perhaps corals is another thing. And then once we have our shapes here, I got myself sidetracked there, we add our little shapes, and we can be a little more variety in those as well, just to indicate maybe the direction that these little creatures are tipping. And so this just allows us, again, a little bit more freedom to imitate that real life creature without being restricted to a pattern where we pre-draw the tops. But whatever works for you in the picture that you are drawing, then you should use that and be happy with it. But I wanted to show you these alternates to give you an example. Now, how might we shade these? Well, the basic shading is very simple. We use a little graphite into these top areas to indicate that they dip down, or perhaps they're hollow. They have some kind of a little divot or indentation on the top. And that's probably the easiest way to shade, the most basic way. So we'll just flesh that out here. We'll blend that graphite a little bit. And in many cases, that would be sufficient, especially if you're drawing these, much smaller than this, or in a smaller scale. It's going to be harder to do a lot with it. You could also add shadows to where they overlap, or where they are behind. You could also add a little I like adding a little bit of a dent or lip that's going to go here that will indicate here in just a moment kind of a subtle indentation in the top of these little creatures. I'll show you how that works. These I just sort of lightly blend that downward and outward a little bit. Outward meaning from side to side. Just like that. Again, these are very subtle details. They're not dramatic. We don't want to add an enormous amount of information on a small shape, but there you go. And let's zoom out because sometimes the effect is a little easier to see at a slight distance. And that's that. So what about this one? Well, this one, if we were going for that more realistic look, we might try a more realistic type of shading. So I'm going to add that darkness in the top so I can blend that area. So that part remains the same. And you can see I'm sort of weighting it to the side that the plant is tipping. And you imagine that these are waving gently in the seawater or the ocean water. So maybe we're going to have a little more darkness in these areas where they overlap and are hiding behind one another. So that might be a little more shaded, darker. Anywhere there's a crevice and the light isn't quite reaching it as easily. And shading like this can be fun. It can be sometimes challenging to capture the effect we're looking for. But when we hit it, it's really fun because we see how we can convince the eye that these are actually individual little shapes nestled in together. And so that's a good way for us to take a look at Zenemone. But there's one other shape we're going to look at today. And this one is called Oysteroid, and it is by Jody Genovese, or Genovese. I'm not sure how she pronounces her last name. This is something that reminded me of sea rocks that I have seen that have sort of layers and where the water has washed them away or worn them down. And so it's a really neat way to draw those layered rock appearances. And we start with just a simple irregular shape, and we add a thickness or a weight to one side or one area. Technically this would be a side, this would be a side. So we just grab some weight, and then we draw an aura very tightly around that. And we add weight again to the same side. As you can see, this makes sort of a layered or a stepped look to this little irregular shape. And of course, you could do as many layers as you'd like, but I'm going to do each little stone here is going to have 3 layers in my example. So I have that one, and now let's add a slightly different shape, and we can overlap them if we'd like. So we just make a little pile of these oysteroid shapes, and then we can shade them. In this case, I'm just going to do a simple overlap shade. So wherever another one goes under a different one, I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to help indicate that stacking effect. And of course, this one is right here. And then, of course, if they're sitting on the bottom of the ocean in a little pile, just like our previous examples, we might have some sand that sort of buries around the edges here, creating a little more of a darkness. We just add some graphite to that to enhance it further. And again, this is a very simplified example of how we may put this fun little tangle to work in our ocean scene that we create together at the end. And there we have it. Of course, this looks like that little guy's floating up there, doesn't it? So we need to make our sand pile a bit more realistic. I don't think we'd have a rock like that floating around. Now there's one additional thing I wanted to introduce here as a concept. So this tangle, Oysteroid, was originally designed sort of as a top-down looking tangle. It's not meant to be three-dimensional. It just has these weighted lines, and I've sort of forced it into a three-dimensional purpose here, which makes it look a little bit off, if you will. But we may want to imagine what that shape would look like if we were viewing it more from the side. So if we're looking at it not from the top, but from the side, we may see something more like this. And it may be a rock with that layered or worn appearance, but we're seeing it in a little different vantage point. And so those dark borders that we're adding here, they really become the shadow lines. Now this is more of a realistic or a 3D in perspective type look, and it may be more advanced than we want to get for our Zentangle project here, but I just wanted to show you that concept because that's why this one looks a little funky when we add a three-dimensional side to it, or I'm sorry, when we add a ground area to it. It just doesn't look convincing to the eye because we're not seeing it in the proper perspective. And so if we start drawing rocks like this, maybe that have more of that perspective, we can immediately see then how that might look on the side. Now we can add more realistic shadows and dark areas as well, again wherever those crevices are that we can't quite see very well or as well because of the absence of light there. That's going to create a darker area for us, so we know about that. We've mentioned that. But these sides where we had this nice heavy bold look, which is great in Zentangle, that would only be created in real life if we had a lack of light on this side closest to us. We would see how this area would get darker. What we imagine here is that there is still less light on this side altogether, and we can create that using our graphite if we needed to add some additional shading, or we could have just used hatching as well and gone a little more into detail there, but I just wanted to show this concept to you and how it doesn't look, or why that other one didn't look quite as convincing to the eye, because your brain knows, wait a minute, if I'm seeing this angle of this, how can I see that angle on the ground underneath it? And of course you couldn't in that same exact way. So this will allow us to make an example here for you of a three-dimensional version of Oysteroid that would be sitting on that ground, and it would be a little more convincing to the eye. We might have waves of sand that are built up around it. It doesn't have to be, literally flat, and it also depends on your vantage point as you are looking at it. If you're laying with your head on the sea floor, or if you're floating above the sea floor and looking down, then you're going to see a little bit different area or a little different perspective on that shape. So what I'm just trying to illustrate here very quickly is how that might appear. Now, we don't have to worry about this now in our understanding of tangles, but I just wanted to give you an example of what that might look like. And I drew another one here that shows another perspective. And you can see here I've tried to include some little cavities in the rocks just like here, and then these are a little bit different. This is more Zentangle-esque in 3D, and this is more of a realistic drawing, kind of like I did over here, or at least a sketch of realism. So that, I just wanted to illustrate that for you. Let me zoom out. You can see all three of these side by side, and you get a completely different look. For our composition, we will use something very much like this Zentangle version, but I hope you enjoyed at least seeing a 3D version. But that's it for today, so thank you so very much for joining with me. I hope to see you again soon back here in the Tangles and Toons channel. Thank you. Bye-bye.